Howdy folks, my name is Caitlin, and today we're going to be talking about the iconic American TV series Bonanza. Growing up, I used to watch a lot of old TV shows like Flipper, Mr. Ed, McHale's Navy, I Love Lucy. I watched Bewitched a little bit, The Monsters, and Fairy Tale Theater, which I did a video on in the past. You should check it out. And then the topic of today's video, which is Bonanza. But this show had 10-year-old me dreaming of living on a ranch, taking care of the cows, tending to the trees. That is just so far removed from like what I want for my life now. I still do have like a special place in my heart for this show. So I kind of just wanted to look back on it with this video and talk about my top 3 favorite episodes of Bonanza. But before we can really dive into all of that, I want to talk about exactly what this show was. Bonanza was an American TV series about Ben Cartwright and his 3 sons, all from different women, all of whom are dead. Don't ask. The show kind of follows them on their various adventures as ranch owners and frontiersmen during roughly 1861 to 1867-69. With a description like that, you'd expect this show to take a distinctly Lone Ranger type of feel. By that, I mean the common Western trope of like the exceptional white man who tames the Wild West with his infantilized POC sidekick. And although there are definitely moments of the show that fall into that kind of territory, I think in general the show was like pretty progressive for what it is. According to Wikipedia and me, hi, I watched the show and I agree with the following statement. Bonanza was considered an atypical Western for its time, as the core of the storylines dealt less about the range and more with Ben and his 3 dissimilar sons, how they cared for one another, their neighbors, and just causes. To expand on that, Bonanza was the first series that was week to week about a family and the troubles it went through. Bonanza was a period drama that attempted to confront contemporary social issues. That was very difficult to do on television. This show was so much more than just another Western, and I think that's what made it so engaging. Not only did it focus primarily on familial conflict, it wasn't afraid to directly address social issues. Episodes like Fear Merchants, Enter Thomas Bowers, Look to the Stars, The War Comes to Washoe tackle discrimination, hate crimes, and slavery with a level of directness that I've yet to see in modern-day television.
Why would anybody want to do a thing like this?
Because Hop Sing is Chinese.
How am I ever going to explain to the ladies of the Virginia City Culture Society that I hadn't known that Thomas Bowers was a... Well, that's not exactly what I meant.
Isn't it, Mrs. Gable? What did you mean? You should have known all about Thomas Bowers. Quite famous, you know. Has given concerts all over Europe. Now, it seems to me that if the color of his skin didn't bother Queen Victoria, it shouldn't bother the fair ladies of Virginia City.
What is it they have in common? They're different.
Joe, I didn't say anything about the girl. Just about what she represents. Which happens to be a system based on the enslavement of human beings.
He just feels the South has the right to work out their own problems. They don't want to be dictated to by a bunch of northern politicians.
You mean it wants to hold on to slavery for another 100 years?
Still, actor Pernell Roberts, who portrays Adam, wasn't a fan of the way the show portrayed people of color, and it's rumored his early departure from the show stemmed from conflicts over that element of production. And I do have to agree with Pernell on this one. This show does dive into some very stereotypical, very negative depictions of people of color, although I would say overall it is, like I said, fairly progressive for the time period. Bonanza ran for 14 years, and in my opinion, the show probably would have lasted even longer if not for the untimely death of actor Dan Blocker, who portrays Ben's second son, Hoss. As a character, Hoss was loving and friendly. Of the Cartwright men, he was definitely the most compassionate, and his softer nature is what helped the show's more empathetic tone come off as genuine. When Dan Blocker passed, Hoss's character was written off as passing in an accident, and season 14 was shot accordingly. However, when it aired, many of the fans didn't tune in, and it was subsequently canceled. But my point is, this show is iconic. It really shaped the way that I look at television and what it's capable of, and I still enjoy cowboy shit to this day because of this goddamn show. Just ask The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su, which is my current obsession and the reason why I wanted to look back on this show in the first place. Here it is. Read this book. It's really good. So with that little introduction, let's talk about some of my favorite episodes of Bonanza. This episode is definitely one of the stranger ones in the series, in the sense that its plot is kind of out there in a way that you'd never expect, even for a show like Bonanza. But the ridiculousness of the episode is only half of the reason I'm mentioning it. The main reason I wanted to start with Hoss and the Leprechauns is that it works as a great introduction to the world of Bonanza. Basically, Hoss discovers a chest full of gold on their property. He's convinced it belongs to little green men. When the chest is stolen back by these men, the Cartwrights attempt to report the theft to the sheriff, but for obvious reasons, he's really not having it. A stranger named Professor McCarthy arrives in Virginia City and fills the townspeople's head with the ideas of gold gifting leprechauns. The people storm the Ponderosa in search of these little men. While Hoss is searching, he ends up stumbling upon one of them with Little Joe. The Cartwrights end up discovering the men's camp, and after the world's most ridiculous fight sequence, the truth is revealed.
I was merely trying to help the lads.
Yeah, and you cheated us out of all our savings, the money we were going to buy the farm with. And our families are still back east waiting for us to send for them.
Hoss decides that the gold should belong to the men who panned it, even though it was panned on their land. He encourages the people of Virginia City to welcome these men and their families with open arms, and the episode ends. Introducing the characters of Bonanza. In this episode, we get to see Ben Cartwright as he is throughout the show. The ever-suffering father, pulled into nonsense because of his son's misadventures. If there's one thing I can say about Ben Cartwright, it's that he loves his sons. His wives, I'm not so sure. But Ben's love of his sons and his ranch eclipse pretty much everything else, and that, coupled with his trusting nature, often cloud his judgment and land him in sticky situations. Like the episode Old Sheba, where Little Joe's scheme lands the Cartwrights with a pet elephant. At the end of the day, though, Ben is wise, and he always tries to do the right thing, and he puts that kind of expectation on his sons as well. Ben's oldest son, Adam, is the practical man of the family. He's rational, intelligent, and wears black all the time. He might be a bit of a bitch.
A little man in a green suit that buried a strong box full of gold dust and then skips away into the bushes, where with a merry twinkle in his eye, he thumbs his nose and flies away to the rainbow.
But he's almost always right. For example, in the episode The War Comes to Washoe, which centers around Nevada's decision to become a state or join the Confederacy, Adam is the only person to tell Little Joe straight up what his girlfriend really stands for, although that entire episode is like a conversation for a different day. Needless to say, Adam is the smart one, to put it simply. This episode focuses mainly on Hoss, Ben's second son. Hoss is like huge, constantly hungry, compassionate, and a little dim-witted. He's definitely the heart of the show. Dan Blocker made Hoss. He put so much heart into the character that I couldn't imagine this show without him. He is, in my opinion, the most important part of Bonanza because his compassion is what separates this show from the many other cowboy shows of the era. We see this in plenty of episodes, including this one.
You ought to be happy to see new investors in the town. Their money is just as big as mine.
Although one of particular note is The Miracle Maker, which focuses on how Hoss's platonic love for a friend helps her walk again. The youngest Cartwright, Little Joe, is actually mixed race. The son of Ben's third wife, a Creole woman from New Orleans, Little Joe is mischievous,
Now, don't you run away.
Oh, I won't. Pa sent me to bring you home to supper.
and utterly obsessed with women. All of these things often get him into trouble. In both Old Sheba and Joe Cartwright Detective, his scheming gets him and Hoss in trouble. And his love of women causes conflict for the Cartwrights in the pilot. War Comes to Washoe, which we've mentioned before, Dark Star, and many, many, many more.
Name's Cartwright. These are my sons.
The Gamble is an iconic episode. It breaks the classic Virginia City and Ponderosa setting, and it removes our main characters from familiar territory by taking them into this new, hostile environment. Let's set the scene. The Cartwrights are traveling back to Virginia City after selling some cattle. They stop in an unfamiliar town, and the following morning, they're booked for murder and robbery. The amount of money they sold their cattle for is the same amount as the money stolen from the local bank, which is $30,000. The description of the robbers also just so happens to match the description of the 3 Cartwright boys, and the big kicker is that the saddlebags of the robbers match the Ponderosa tree crest on the Cartwright saddlebags.
I gave this man a bill of sale, a copy of a bill of sale that proves that it was our money.
No tricks, mister.
What tricks?
So it's not looking good. The Cartwrights are falsely convicted of murder and robbery and sentenced to hanging, which is intense for this show. You might not think that's intense because this is a cowboy show, but like, to be honest, this is definitely one of the more intense storylines of the series. Little Joe manages to escape. He returns to the Ponderosa. He rallies the men of the ranch to rescue his family, and he returns just in time, revealing the conspiracy in front of the entire town.
All right, Stan, tell him who shot the teller.
It was Howdy.
No!
In the end, the Cartwrights ride off to the Ponderosa, justice having been served. There are a couple reasons why I love this episode, but let's try and keep it short and sweet. I'll focus on 3 key aspects that make this episode stand out. Part 1, the action. I think the action is probably one of the biggest draws for this episode. It has a horse chase, a fight sequence, and a shootout. Like, that is the trifecta of Western action sequences. Shout out to Little Joe for riding on one side of his horse. Like, that just looks cool to me. I'm sorry. Okay. I think it looks cool. I think it's also important to point out that action sequences aren't that common in Bonanza, or at least they're not as important in this show. Because, to reiterate, Bonanza was driven by interpersonal conflict rather than physical violence. More often than not, the violence is motivated by interpersonal conflicts and plays second hat in terms of importance to the plot. Part 2, the people. Speaking of which, something I love about this show is that the characters within it are actually pretty complex. In this episode, the villains in particular are displayed not as opportunistic evildoers, but complicated and intelligently nefarious villains. Forget his name, but like the guy who works in the livery, he wants to escape, the livery, but there's more to him than just that. Like, he's very clearly a sociopath.
He's too dumb to handle all that money, Sheriff. Maybe he should fall down and die. I just kind of like looking at men that know they're going to die in a few hours, that's all.
Money might be his excuse, but bloodshed is clearly his actual motivation. The deputy has like a pretty cut and dry motivation. He wants the money so that him and his barmaid girlfriend can skip town, yada yada yada. And the leader of this little gang is actually pretty interesting because he doesn't even have a clear motive, yet he goes to great lengths to help these men.
Stan and Artie, they had their reasons for wanting the money. Me, I wouldn't have known what to do with it.
And not only are there like those kind of small sections to help humanize our villains, but we also have scenes that are surprisingly intimate and vulnerable, especially for a cowboy show.
Joe took all those guys hand wrestling at the Bucket of Blood. You and me had bought him all rounds of drinks to let him do it.
We never did tell him, did we?
No.
You do think of silly things.
What?
Like how green the grass gets in the springtime. The snow in the winter. All the things we take for granted every day.
Part 3, the stakes. This is one of the few episodes that actually has major stakes for the Cartwrights themselves. In The Gamble, the Cartwrights aren't just on the sidelines watching their friends suffer or acting as just leaders trying to keep the angry mob of Virginia City at bay. They are in the action this time. They're not saving their friends from near death, they're the ones who are actually about to die. And I was so engaged in this episode because it's one of the few that actually feels like something big could happen. And even though it ends with Little Joe saving them and, it's like per usual stuff, he does so by gathering the ranch hands or friends that they, in like a standard episode, would be saving. So it almost feels full circle, where the people that they help come to rescue them.
Just one man? I think you better count again, Sheriff.
For an ugly bunch, ain't they pretty?
What school did you get that from?
School of Hard Knocks, same one you went to, Ben.
Only I don't call myself a lawyer.
This is the first episode of Bonanza that I ever watched, and it got me hooked on the show and the Cartwright clan. This episode is just really complex. Like, there are a lot of different layers to what's happening in it, and I think that's why I like it so much. Like, there's so much happening, but none of it feels particularly, The episode follows the Chinese community in Virginia City as they're harassed as part of a local lawyer's grab for mayor. The main conflict centers around James Lee, an 18-year-old Chinese boy who's accused of murdering the daughter of his white boss. The young woman was a notorious flirt, and they even kind of tease like this borderline romantic dynamic between her and Jimmy.
That's all right, Miss Sally. Leave me alone.
All I did was bathe your face. A girl would do that for anyone.
Yes, anyone.
I didn't mean it the way it sounded.
While Jimmy is accused of the crime, in actuality it was committed by her own father, who shot her on accident. However, Mr. Ridley is manipulated into testifying against Jimmy by Andy Turner, an uneducated lawyer running for mayor of Virginia City on the platform of
Virginia City for Virginia City. It means our town's being overrun by foreigners who are willing to work for nothing. And they're taking the bread and butter out of the mouths of folks like us who built this country.
The Cartwrights support Jimmy and protect him from the literal mob that tries to before he can have a fair trial. Adam talks Mr. Ridley's daughter Amanda into convincing her father to tell the truth. She calls both him and herself out for saying terrible things about her dead sister, as well as leaving Jimmy to take the blame for them.
You and I, Father. We're the guilty ones.
However, just as Mr. Ridley attempts to tell everyone the truth, Andy has him killed. It's too late. Amanda reveals the truth to everyone, and Jimmy is set free.
Sally was just exactly the way you used to be, no more, no less. You don't need to pretend with me, Amanda.
What's most remarkable about this episode is that, just like the majority of the show, the importance isn't placed on the action or the lawlessness of Virginia City. It's placed on the interpersonal relationships of all these characters. The main conflict of this episode, Sarah's death, is caused by her own father and their dissimilar views. It's Andy that co-opts that interpersonal conflict and makes it into a citywide concern by spinning it as a racial issue and feeding the anti-Chinese sentiment that's already stewing within Virginia City. It's so interesting to see how the conflict is resolved not by more violence, but by empathy and understanding. Adam is able to break through to Amanda by empathizing with her struggle in her mother's absence, which makes perfect sense if you think about his character's position as the oldest sibling who lost not only his own mother, but both of his stepmothers, and has to support his father and brother as like the level-headed voice of reason. Amanda also reaches out to her father with empathy and understanding. The two of them realize how they demonized not only Jimmy, but Sarah by painting her as a slut who had it coming.
Well, what did you expect? Everybody in town knows what kind of a girl my sister was.
At the end of the episode, rather than reveling in the violence or enacting another act of violence as revenge, Ben simply points out how Andy's hunger for power cost the town 3 lives. And then everyone abandons him as a viable candidate for mayor.
If I find out that you or any of your boys had anything to do with beating up my cook, I'll tie a rope around you. And I'll drag you up and down Main Street.
I also want to point out that throughout the episode, we have these smaller subplots that point out how this racism was directly impacting the Chinese community in Virginia City. For example, when the shop owner basically refuses to sell Mr. Lee American flags for Jimmy's birthday cake. Or the more violent example, when the Cartwright's cook Hop Sing is beaten in the street. I think some interesting moments of discussion are the Cartwright's conversation after Hop Sing arrives at the Ponderosa post beatdown, Ben's conversation with Andy about his platform for election, and Mr. Lee's conversation with the other members of the Tong Society. These scenes are so engaging because they focus on each character's relationship to the problem of anti-Chinese sentiment. The conversation in the Tong Society is particularly interesting because that group is meant to protect the Chinese immigrants in town, but they refuse to help Jimmy. I think this was mainly played to illustrate the Cartwrights as the sole protectors of the innocent or whatever, but I also think it demonstrates the already established reality of this Chinese community. They're already being targeted by Andy and his supporters, and to speak out in favor of Jimmy is to bring out the wrath of not just those already steaming with anti-Chinese sentiment, but the entire town.
It is better to sacrifice one lamb than to cause the slaughter of the entire flock.
This episode is so complex. It has really good writing, and its message is unfortunately very relevant to this day.
Well, little brother, I don't know when I was gladder to see you.
Yeah, what took you so long?
I really like Bonanza. This show is iconic. It's definitely a standout Western. It's an incredible series. It's also downright entertaining, at least for me. It's one of those series where I'm begging Hollywood to stay away from it. What was achieved in and with this show is not something that can ever be recreated. It's a product of its time, for better and for worse. So do not touch it, please. It's crazy to think about how my mom and her grandmother watched this show while it was airing, all those years ago, and then streaming services made it possible for me to watch this show growing up. I think that's so cool. I think it's good to look back on these old shows and talk about what they did right, what they did wrong. I didn't really discuss what Bonanza got wrong in this video because I mainly wanted to talk about all the reasons why I liked it, but just know I'm not ignorant to the fact that this show is very ignorant. I would say its portrayal of Native Americans in particular is really... I don't like it. Any episode with Native Americans in it is definitely... That is a conversation for a different day. So with that, I have finished my long rant about this old cowboy show. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed revisiting this show. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you whenever I see you next.